Welcome to Metabolism and Bioenergetics Part 3. This video lecture will focus on the electron transport chain and ATP production. Let's get started. So, we're going to have to bring in some biology here because the electron transport chain is happening in the mitochondria of the cell. So let's work our way down into the actual organelle, right? So here is our eukaryotic cell, and remember that the cytosol, right, is the fluid portion of the cytoplasm. And this is just a reminder, remember, so by now, right, there's an energetic process that can happen in the cytosol of the cell. So ideally, there's glycolysis is popping into your brain. If not, just keep working on it, right? So glycolysis, right? So we do have some cells in our body that do not have mitochondria. Our red blood cells and our brain cells, they don't have mitochondria. Their entire energy production comes from glycolysis, which we've already studied. But right now, we're going to focus on the energy processes that do occur in the mitochondria. So that's right here, and there's quite a few. And the mitochondria structure, if we go in and slice out a chunk, we can see that there is a double membrane, right? So here we have the inner membrane, and then there's an outer membrane. And then there's this space between them, the intermembrane space. And when we actually start to talk about the electron transport chain, we will be talking in particular about this intermembrane space. So that's why we're taking the time to make sure that you understand where these are in the mitochondria. And then the very center of the mitochondria, that is the matrix. We will also be talking about that a little bit. And then here, when we see the blow up, here's the ATP synthase. After the electron transport chain, then the ATP synthase actually produces the ATP. So this is all really complex, and it's not very practical to draw this over and over. So it gets simplified into this little schematic here. So here's the citric acid cycle that we've talked about before. And then what the new part is that we're going to focus on today then would be here is, right, embedded in the inner membrane. This would be the electron transport chain. All right, so I'm just going to draw this box right here, right? That would, whoops, make sure you have enough room. All right, this would be the electron transport chain. All right, so here, right, so here on the inside, right, there's the inner membrane. There's the outer membrane. And then here is that intermembrane space in the middle. Okay, so the electron transport chain has 4 complexes, complexes 1 through 4. And then from there, that feeds into ATP synthase, which we see in our diagram. And sometimes, some authors in some books actually call this complex 5. Alrighty, so coming out of the citric acid cycle, we have learned, right, that we get reduced coenzymes like NADH and FADH2. And we are also going to need oxygen. It also comes in as a reactant in the electron transport chain. It's going to spit out water and then continue on, and then during the ATP synthase, basically the electron transport chain is going to generate this protomotive force that will then fuel the ATP synthase to produce the ATP. So the electron transport chain is like charging up the motor, and then the motor then is the ATP synthase, which actually produces the ATP. All right, so now that we have the big picture and we understand where this is happening in the cell and an overview of the energy, let's go in and actually look at the electron transport chain. All right, so I put this little diagram here to remind you of, this is just a small piece of the mitochondria. And here is the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 4 complexes of the electron transport chain. And then here would be the ATP synthase, or complex 5. Alrighty, so, right, so remember, right, that the citric acid cycle has produced 3 NADHs, right? One turn of the citric acid cycle produces 3 NADHs and 1 FADH2. Now, it's important to note that the NADH enters the electron transport chain at complex 1. And see how complex 1 crosses through the inner membrane. And so during complex 1, protons are pushed into the intermembrane space. Then these electrons go through a handoff. There's CoQ, it's a coenzyme. It's able to move through the inner membrane. It passes off the electrons to complex 3, and more electrons are pushed into the intermembrane space. And then cytochrome C further pushes the electrons along to complex 4, and we get additional protons pumped into the inner membrane space. And then ultimately, these protons come back into the matrix, and that's when we get our ATP production. So, the difference between the NADH and the FADH2 is FADH2, it comes in at complex 2. Notice that complex 2 does not go fully through the inner membrane. So there are no protons pushed in complex 2. So the electrons from the FADH2 go from 2, 3 to 4. So with FADH2, less hydrogens are pumped into the intermembrane space. So let's talk a little bit more about this now that we've carefully looked at the diagram. Let's talk about the importance, right? So the accumulation of these hydrogens, right, in the intermembrane space creates stored chemical and electrical potential energy, right? Because we've learned about diffusion when we studied solution chemistry, right? There's that natural tendency for ions to diffuse from areas of high concentration to low concentration, right? So here we have our high H plus concentration, and down here in the matrix we have a low H plus concentration. So the hydrogen ions want to become homogeneous, so there's this potential energy that they just want to go, but they're blocked by the ATP synthase, right? And so the only way for the protons to re-enter, right, is through the ATP synthase. So the protons are pumped out of the matrix via the electron transport chain, and then they return providing energy, kind of like a water wheel, right, spinning at a mill. And then that's what produces the energy for the ATP synthase to convert the ADP into the ATP. All right? So that's the electron transport chain. This is a very simplified model of it, but it's enough for us. You know, if you really become intrigued and decide to be a biochemist, then you can go in and learn a lot more about it. But for us, this serves our needs. I'd like to look a little deeper at the oxidation and reduction reactions of the electron transport chain, right? As we mentioned previously, right, the complexes are fixed within the inner membrane, and so there are a variety of compounds that actually move the electrons from one complex to another. And so this is a great opportunity to take the oxidation and reduction knowledge that we've learned and apply it to the electron transport chain. Alrighty, so there's two tasks here. Label the coenzymes as oxidized or reduced, and then add the appropriate label to the reaction arrows, right? Because during the electron transport chain, if we're going to have oxidation and reduction reactions, right, we need oxidizing and reducing agents to do the complement reaction so that we can have the handoff. This would be a good place for you to pause the video and see how well you do on your own, and then we can compare answers. Okay, let's see how you did. Right, so here's coenzyme Q that often gets simplified as CoQ. And then here's coenzyme Q and then H2, right? And this is an organic compound. We see, right, the gain of hydrogen. So even with just from the abbreviation, we can tell that this is the reduced form and this is the oxidized form. But then let's look at the actual structure to convince you, right? Here we see, right, that we have 2 carbon-oxygen bonds, and now we only have 1, right? So this is the oxidized form, more bonds to oxygen, reduced form, less bonds. So when the oxidized goes to the reduced, right, that's going to be reduction. And then if the reduced goes to the oxidized, right? So it's important to be clear on the terms, whether we're talking about the form of the compound or the reaction. Make sure to answer the question that's being asked. Right, okay, so here, iron is a big deal. It appears in the cytochrome C proteins. And if we look here, so here's the iron in the +3, right? And now it's gaining an electron to the +2, right? So this is the oxidized state. And then this would be the reduced state, right? Because we gained electrons. So this is our reduction reaction. And then it can go back and be oxidized over and over again. Our bodies are so efficient. We're the ultimate recyclers. It's a great thing. Oh, so we needed to put these on our arrows up here. We'll put it up here too, just to make sure that everyone's clear. Okay. And then this last one, it's pretty straightforward. And it's very similar. If you understand cytochrome C, then here are the iron-sulfur complexes. So different chemical structure, but notice that they're still taking advantage of, here we have the iron 3, right? So the iron 3 is the oxidized form. And then, whoops, oh, there it is. There's the iron 3, and then there's the iron 2. And that's the reduced form. So it's the exact same answers as before. So here, there's our reduction reaction, gaining electrons, and our oxidation. So those, as the electrons are handed off, these coenzymes are needed as part of the electron relay. Alrighty, so now let's practice this on the next page. So here is a portion of the electron transport chain pathway for complex 1. And here are 3 tasks. So relate this diagram to the structure of the mitochondria. Where's the intermembrane space and where's the matrix? And then add the missing elements or ions and classify each reaction, right? Okay, so let's do A first, right? So we're going to pump the electrons into the intermembrane space. So this part of the diagram would be where the intermembrane space is. Oops, lost our plus, okay? And so then that means that the matrix would be down here, right? So this would represent the center of the mitochondria, the intermembrane space, and then the outer membrane. Alrighty, now, at first, B can look a little tricky. Yikes, how do I know what to do? Well, what do we know about NADH, right? We know that it has 2 forms, So if it's NADH here, it has to be NAD+. So NAD+ going to NADH, right? It's gaining a hydrogen. So this would be a reduction reaction. Now, as the NAD+ is being reduced, the CoQ is being oxidized. CoQ, right? So that would be our oxidation. And then, right, so now CoQ, if it goes to CoQH2, it's gaining hydrogen, so that's a reduction. And right, reduction and oxidation always have to occur together. So if the CoQ is being reduced, then the iron would have to be oxidized to our +3. Okay, so there's an example of the handoff of electrons in the electron transport chain. And now I'd like to do one last thing to put this all together. We've studied the citric acid cycle, and now we've studied the electron transport chain. We need to link these together, so because they're really part of a bigger system. So let's focus on what we've learned. Right, so here's the citric acid cycle in a very simplified form. There are 2 carbons that enter, right, and that's from acetyl-CoA. Right, so the acetyl group, right, there's that acetyl group, that 2-carbon group. Then when I say C2, it's referring to this acetyl group right here. Okay, and so every time an acetyl-CoA hands off 2 electrons to the citric acid cycle, we end up, right, with reduced coenzymes. We end up with an NADH here and another NADH here. And then we get the GTP, which the body is very capable of isomerizing to ATP. And some textbooks even show ATP instead of GTP. So don't let that stress you out. Then we get an FADH2. And finally, we get one more NADH. All right? So from the citric acid cycle, 1 acetyl-K goes in, and then ultimately we get, 1 ATP, 3 NADHs, and 1 FADH2. All right? Now, these reduced coenzymes are going to go into the electron transport chain. All right, so here we have a schematic of the electron transport chain. And what we need to know before we can finish solving this is that when 1 NADH enters the electron transport chain, ultimately 3 ATP can be produced. And when 1 FADH2 enters the electron transport chain, only 2 ATP are produced, right? And that's because, remember that NADH enters at complex 1 and can pump protons through complex 1, complex 3, and complex 4, right? So NADH pumps more protons into the intermembrane space, so we get more ATP. Where FADH2 enters at complex 2, where no electrons are pumped, so less protons are pumped. So less protons are pumped, less energy. You can really I think about like one of those crank flashlights, right? So the more cranks you do on the flashlight, the brighter the light will get, the longer it will go. So NADH is able to crank the flashlight more than FADH2. Alrighty, so now we need to bring this information together, right? So overall, from that 1 acetyl-CoA that we started with up here, right, we get the 1 ATP, and then from the 3 NADHs, right, we're going to multiply those. We get 3 ATP each, right, per NADH. And then we got the 1 FADH2. And from the electron transport chain, we get 2 ATP per FADH2. Voila. Right? So now when we add this all together, right, we would get 1 plus 9 plus 2, which is 12 ATP. And that's from, right, 1 acetyl-CoA. Ooh, just fit. Okay. Alrighty. So that wraps up our overview of the electron transport chain. This would be a great time to work a couple post-video practice problems to reinforce your understanding.